Drugs. I knew it. He's nothing but a criminal. Karen Whitfield shrieked at the top of her lungs, waving a tiny plastic bag of white powder like she'd just struck gold. Her voice echoed across the cul-de-sac, drawing neighbors out onto their porches, phones already raised to record the spectacle. Rick and Tommy, her so-called HOA security, yanked me out of my car and shoved me onto the pavement. My suit jacket tore at the shoulder, my knees hit the ground hard, and Karen strutted forward with that smug grin that could sour milk. Emily, my wife, rushed down the driveway screaming for them to stop. But Karen only laughed louder, holding the bag higher for everyone to see. Caught red-handed HOA law will not be mocked, she declared as if she were judge, jury, and executioner. I stayed silent, breathing steady. Then I lifted my eyes to hers and spoke softly. Karen, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where you're watching from. To anyone watching that humiliating scene unfold, I must have looked like just another man caught breaking the rules in a neighborhood run by petty tyrants. And that was exactly how Karen Whitfield wanted it. She thrived on drama, on power, on bending everyone to her ridiculous HOA laws. But the truth, my name is Michael Grant, and I'm not the type of man you frame and walk away unscathed from. By day, or rather by every waking hour, I serve as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the very agency Karen was blindly poking with a stick. Of course, no one in this neighborhood knew that. To them, I was the quiet, middle-aged man who trimmed his hedges on Saturday mornings, waved politely when walking the dog, and paid his dues without complaint. My wife Emily loved it that way. She liked the illusion of normalcy, the safe cocoon of suburbia. After decades in law enforcement, I promised her peace. We bought the house for that very reason. But peace is something you never truly have when Karen Whitfield lives across the street. Karen was the self-crowned queen of Oak Ridge Estates, a woman in her 50s widowed with too much free time and far too much hairspray. She wore neon-colored suits that screamed louder than her voice, which, trust me, was already enough to rattle glass. Her obsession with the HOA went beyond enforcing neighborhood standards. She treated it like her personal kingdom, where every lawn was her battlefield and every driveway her courtroom. The first time she targeted me, it was almost laughable. She left a citation on my mailbox claiming that my grass was exceeding regulation height by 1 inch. I actually measured it, she was wrong. But I paid the fine anyway. No sense in making enemies right. The second time she complained that my car was parked at a slightly improper angle. That was her actual wording. Again, I ignored it. Let her have her power trip. But then came the third incident, this one cut deeper. Emily had planted roses along our front fence. They bloomed beautifully red and full, the kind of flowers you'd expect in a storybook garden. Karen fined us $200 for unauthorized flora. Emily cried the night we had to trim them back. That was when I knew Karen wasn't just annoying, she was cruel. And Karen never worked alone. She had her enforcers. Rick Dalton was the first. Mid-30s bald, his arms sleeved with tattoos of skulls and flames. He wore cheap tactical gear with HOA security patches that looked like they'd been ordered off a knockoff website. He strutted around with the kind of false confidence you only see in men who've been thrown out of the real military. Then there was Tommy Briggs. Taller, bulkier, always carrying a nightstick he twirled like he thought it made him intimidating. Between the two of them, they played the part of Karen's muscle. Everyone knew they weren't real cops, but Karen acted like their word was law. And when Karen spoke, people listened, if only out of fear of what she'd do next. That was the atmosphere in Oak Ridge Estates, fear. Neighbors whispered about Karen's antics, but rarely stood up to her. The Johnsons once got a $500 fine because their daughter's bicycle was left in the driveway overnight. The Lees nearly lost their pool permit because Karen claimed the water was too loud during parties. People caved. People always caved. Except me. I played along, smiled politely, and pretended like Karen's little games mattered. I let her think she was in control. Because here's the thing, when you're FBI director, you don't get angry at bullies. You watch, you study, and then when the timing is perfect, you strike. Still, I didn't expect Karen to take it this far. Planting drugs, that was a new low even for her, but looking back, I could see the signs. She had been escalating for weeks, testing the boundaries, pushing to see how far she could go before someone pushed back. Emily hated it. She'd say, "Michael, just talk to her. Please, I don't like the way she looks at you." But talking to Karen was like reasoning with a hurricane. She didn't want peace, she wanted conquest. I remember one particular evening sitting on the porch with Emily watching the sun dip behind the houses. She asked me, "Why do you let her treat you like this?" I smiled, sipping my coffee, and said, "Because sooner or later Karen will bury herself. All I have to do is wait." And oh, how right I was. The day it happened started out like any other. I'd flown back from D.C. that morning after a brutal week of meetings with the Attorney General and congressional committees. My mind was filled with national security briefings, cyber threats, counterintelligence operations. Heavy stuff. And yet the moment I turned onto my street, the biggest threat to my peace of mind wasn't international espionage. It was Karen Whitfield, in her pink suit, standing at the end of my driveway like a vulture. She had Rick and Tommy with her, which already spelled trouble. But what truly struck me was the crowd, neighbors peeking out of windows, lingering on sidewalks, phones in hand. It was as if Karen had orchestrated an audience for my humiliation, and in a way she had. She barked orders at Rick and Tommy like a general commanding soldiers. Search the car, don't let him hide anything. They obeyed, tearing through my vehicle with the grace of sledgehammers. And then right on cue, Karen gasped theatrically and pulled a small plastic bag from the glove compartment. White powder. The crowd erupted. Some gasped, some whispered, others recorded gleefully. My wife Emily screamed my name, rushing forward only to be held back by Tommy's outstretched arm. Karen grinned wide, waving the bag high. In that moment, everything clicked. All the petty fines, all the escalating harassment, the smug looks she gave me every time she passed by. This wasn't about HOA violations. This was about power. Karen wanted to show everyone that she could bring down even the most untouchable. She thought she was above the law. What she didn't know was that the law was sitting on his knees in zip ties, staring right back at her. And in that split second, as the neighbors gawked and the cameras rolled, I realized something. Karen Whitfield had just set the stage for her own downfall. The zip ties cut into my wrists as Rick Dalton tightened them with a cruel smirk. His partner, Tommy Briggs, shoved me against the hood of my own car. My tie slid sideways, and the polished shoes I'd worn that morning in Washington, D.C., scraped against the rough pavement of my driveway. Neighbors whispered behind raised phones, their voices a mix of disbelief and morbid excitement. Karen Whitfield strutted forward like she was on a runway, heels clicking against the asphalt. She held that little bag of white powder aloft like a trophy, her voice ringing out across the cul-de-sac. "Ladies and gentlemen, I told you he was no better than a common thug. Look at this, caught red-handed drugs in his car." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people shook their heads in shock, others whispered to each other, already convinced of my guilt. That's how Karen worked. She didn't just attack, she poisoned perception. To the HOA, queen appearances were everything. I stayed silent. Years of interrogation rooms had taught me one truth: silence unnerves tyrants more than shouting ever could. But Karen wasn't alone. Rick leaned down, his hot breath stinking of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. "Thought you were slick, huh? Fancy suit, nice car. Doesn't matter. HOA runs this neighborhood." He shoved me harder against the hood. Tommy chuckled, gripping his nightstick like he couldn't wait to use it. Emily cried out from the porch, her voice raw and panicked. "Michael, stop this madness. He hasn't done anything." She tried to rush forward, but Karen whipped around, jabbing a finger at her. "Stay back, Emily, unless you want to be charged as an accomplice." My wife froze, tears streaking down her face. I clenched my jaw but forced myself to remain calm. Losing control now would only feed Karen's performance. Because that's what this was, a performance. Karen had been preparing for this moment. She thrived on spectacle, on grandstanding in front of neighbors who were too timid to defy her. And now, with two thugs at her side and a planted bag of drugs, she thought she'd staged her masterpiece. She circled me like a shark, her shrill voice carrying. "For months I've warned you all. I've seen his type before. Quiet, sneaky, thinks the rules don't apply. And now, look, proof drugs in our safe, family-friendly neighborhood. I won't let Oak Ridge Estates be turned into a ghetto." That last word stung. She knew what she was doing. Karen's cruelty wasn't just about rules. It was about prejudice, power, and fear. And the neighbors, most of them too cowardly to intervene, just watched. But a few looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Johnson whispered to her husband. "That doesn't seem right," Mr. Lee muttered. "How would he even get drugs?" The seeds of doubt had been planted. Still, Karen pressed on, fueled by her own arrogance. She crouched down so her heavily perfumed face was level with mine. "Any last words before the police arrive? Because once they see this bag, your life is over." I lifted my head, met her eyes, and whispered, "Karen, you don't know how right you are. But not about me, about you." Her smirk faltered just for a split second. Rick barked, "Shut up," and yanked me upright, but the damage was done. That tiny crack of doubt in Karen's confidence, it was there. The so-called HOA security decided to escalate. Tommy pulled out a pair of rusted handcuffs, clicking them open menacingly. "We should book him at the clubhouse, make it official," he said, as if their fake badges gave them jurisdiction. Karen clapped her hands together. "Excellent idea. Let the whole neighborhood see justice in action." Justice. That word burned in my ears. I dedicated my entire career to it. Real justice, the kind that required evidence, integrity, truth. What Karen offered was nothing more than mob rule wrapped in pink polyester. They dragged me down the street toward the clubhouse neighbors, trailing behind like it was some twisted parade. Children peeked out from behind parents wide-eyed and frightened. One teenager live-streamed the whole thing, narrating like a commentator at a boxing match. I caught fragments of whispers. "I can't believe it. He seemed so normal. Karen always knew." The court of public opinion was already leaning in Karen's favor exactly as she wanted. Inside my mind worked like a machine. Protocols. Contingencies. FBI, emergency response times. I knew my silence was temporary. Karen had set the stage, but she didn't realize she wasn't the director here. I was. When we reached the clubhouse, Rick shoved me into a plastic chair while Tommy loomed over me. Karen pranced around, still holding the bag of powder. "I'm filing the report myself," she announced proudly. "This will go on record. Once the real police arrive, they'll see everything. I've got the evidence. I've got the witnesses. There's no escape for you, Mr. Grant." I tilted my head slightly. "You're right about one thing, Karen. There's no escape. But not for me." Her smile wavered again. Rick growled, gripping my shoulder. Big talk for a guy in cuffs. I didn't answer. Instead, I let the weight of my silence hang heavy in the air. Years of interrogations had taught me patience. You let your opponent dig their own grave, and Karen was digging fast. Emily burst into the clubhouse, pushing past a hesitant crowd. Her face was red, streaked with tears, but her voice was strong. "Stop this. You have no authority. Michael hasn't done anything wrong." Karen spun on her venom, dripping from her tone. "Authority. I am the HOA president. That makes me the law here." The room went silent. Even Rick and Tommy exchanged uneasy glances. Karen's obsession with control had slipped into full-blown delusion. I leaned back in the chair, zip ties biting into my wrists, and smiled faintly. Because in that moment, I knew the higher Karen climbed on her shaky pedestal, the harder her fall would be. And her fall was coming. Very soon. Karen Whitfield thrived on theater, and that night she thought she was staging her magnum opus. The clubhouse had become her courtroom, her kingdom, and I, Michael Grant, husband, neighbor, ordinary man, was her villain. The bag of powder was her prop. She paraded it back and forth, holding it up for the neighbors, crowded inside, gasping and whispering as if they'd walked into the climax of a crime drama. She shook it like it was Exhibit A in some grand trial. "This is the kind of poison he was planning to spread into our neighborhood," Karen declared, her voice shrill, bouncing off the drywall. "While our children play outside, this man hides drugs in his car." "Do you want Oak Ridge Estates to become a haven for criminals?" Some of the neighbors booed. Others crossed their arms, unconvinced but unwilling to say anything against Karen. The Johnsons stood near the back, frowning. The Lees exchanged worried glances. Everyone was waiting to see how far Karen would push. I sat in that flimsy plastic chair, wrists bound, my suit wrinkled and torn. I looked every bit the defeated man Karen wanted me to be. But inside, my mind was as sharp as ever, cataloging every word, every gesture. Because in my world, every lie is evidence. Rick Dalton loomed beside me, nightstick tapping rhythmically against his palm. Tommy Briggs leaned against the wall near the door, arms crossed, pretending to be a sentry. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like security officers. To me, they looked exactly what they were, washed-up muscle hired by a desperate woman. Karen set the bag down on the folding table in the center of the room, then leaned dramatically over it like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "He thinks he's better than us. He drives his fancy car, wears his fancy suits, pretends the rules don't apply. But tonight, the truth comes out. Nobody is above HOA law. HOA law." The words dripped from her mouth like they carried the same weight as the Constitution. It would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. Emily, my wife, stood near the doorway, trembling. Her eyes darted to mine, silently pleading, "Say something. End this." But I stayed silent. Timing was everything, and Karen hadn't finished burying herself yet. Rick finally lost patience. "Why don't we just call the cops already?" he asked, bored. Karen raised a manicured finger and wagged it. "Not yet. First, we document everything. We'll take photos, record statements. By the time the police get here, the case will be airtight." With exaggerated flair, she pulled out her phone and began snapping pictures of the baggie of my car keys on the table of me sitting bound in the chair. She even forced Emily into the frame, sneering accomplice caught in denial. Emily's cheeks flushed red with anger. "This is insane, Karen. You know he didn't do this." Karen smirked, lowering her phone. "Funny thing about evidence, Emily, it doesn't matter what you think. It matters what they see." She gestured to the crowd of neighbors, many of whom were still filming. "And right now, they see your husband caught with cocaine in his car." I shifted in my chair, straightened my back, and finally spoke. My voice was calm, measured, the kind that made even seasoned criminals break into a sweat. Careful, Karen. Every move you make is being recorded, too. And trust me, the truth always has a way of surfacing. She laughed, a sharp, mocking cackle. Oh, please. What truth? You're a nobody. A fraud. Once the police arrive, you'll be in handcuffs for real. Prison orange will suit you better than Armani. Rick chuckled. Tommy grinned. The neighbors murmured. Emily covered her mouth, eyes wide. I let her words hang in the air for a moment, then leaned forward as far as the zip ties allowed. You've just written your own ending, Karen, and you don't even realize it. That flicker of doubt crossed her face again, fleeting but unmistakable. She didn't like that I wasn't begging, wasn't panicking. She thrived on fear, and I wasn't giving her any. So she doubled down. Karen snatched up the baggie, marched over, and thrust it inches from my face. Deny it all you want, Michael, but this is the truth. I locked eyes with her. No, Karen, that's your lie. And lies have fingerprints. Her smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat. Then she shoved the bag back onto the table and barked, Rick, call the police. Tell them we've caught a drug dealer. Rick pulled out his phone, grinning, already dialing. Tommy stood taller, puffing his chest like he was about to make the biggest arrest of his life. The neighbors pressed closer, eager for the climax. Emily's voice broke through, sharp and desperate. Stop this. He hasn't done anything. Karen whirled on her, her voice rising to a fever pitch. He's guilty, Emily, guilty. I am the law here. The words echoed in the clubhouse, bouncing off the walls, hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, even her loyal thugs froze, as if realizing she'd gone too far. The neighbors whispered uneasily. She can't say that. She's not the law. But Karen either didn't notice or didn't care. She was drunk on the performance, blind to how her arrogance was unraveling her carefully crafted facade. And me, I sat there calm as ever because I knew something she didn't. Protocols had already been set in motion. My silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. The longer she ranted, the deeper the hole she dug. And soon, very soon, her stage would be crashed by actors she hadn't invited. Karen thought she was framing me, but in reality, she was building the case against herself, piece by piece, word by word, fingerprint by fingerprint. And when the curtain finally dropped, it wouldn't be me left in ruins. It would be her. The clubhouse smelled of sweat-cheap cologne and Karen's overpowering perfume. I sat there in that flimsy plastic chair, wrists cinched behind me, while Karen strutted back and forth like some deranged peacock. Her pink suit practically glowed under the fluorescent lights. She waved the bag of powder again, milking the moment. Any minute now, the police will arrive, she declared, her voice echoing. And when they do this, man's life will be over. Oak Ridge Estates will be safe once again. The neighbors shifted uneasily. Some nodded, some whispered, and some, I could tell, weren't buying it anymore. Doubt was creeping in. That was when fate lent a hand. As Rick leaned down to gloat, his meaty hand gripping my shoulder, something slipped from my briefcase, which Karen's goons had tossed carelessly to the floor earlier. The latch had popped open, and a small black leather wallet slid across the tile with a soft thud. It landed in plain sight. For a moment, nobody noticed. Then Mrs. Johnson, standing near the back, squinted. "Is that?" she murmured, pointing. Karen whipped her head around, eyes narrowing. She bent down and snatched it up before anyone else could touch it. She flipped it open, expecting to find a credit card or maybe a driver's license. Instead, her face went pale, because staring back at her, embossed in silver on black leather, was the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "That's federal." Another voice added, "That looks real." Karen snapped the wallet shut and plastered a smile across her face, forcing a laugh. "Oh, please, a fake ID. Probably ordered online." Pathetic attempt to look important, but her voice cracked ever so slightly. Rick frowned. Tommy shifted uneasily. The neighbors leaned in their phones, zooming their whispers louder now. The tide of perception was shifting, and Karen could feel it. I finally spoke, my voice calm, deliberate. "Karen, you should have left it where it fell. Because now everyone in this room knows you're not framing some ordinary man." Her nostrils flared. "Silence," she barked, clutching the wallet tighter. "You're nothing. A fraud." When the police arrived, the door burst open. Not the police. 2 HOA committee members, dragged in by the commotion, entered. One of them, a graying man named Harold Benson, was respected in the neighborhood. He took one look at the wallet in Karen's hand and blanched. That's a federal badge." Karen laughed nervously. "Don't be ridiculous, Harold. This man's a liar, a criminal. Look at what I found in his car." She thrust the baggie into the air again. But the whispers had turned into conversations now. What if it's real? What if she planted it? She's gone too far this time. I leaned back in my chair, letting the murmurs swell. Timing. Always timing. Then the sound that changed everything, distant sirens. The real police were on their way. Karen smirked again, trying to regain control. Perfect, they'll be here any second. And when they arrive, they'll see everything. But this time, her words rang hollow. Because the neighbors weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at her with suspicion, with doubt, with the first stirrings of rebellion. Emily seized the moment. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. Everyone here knows Michael. He's never broken a single rule. He's paid every fine, followed every ridiculous demand. And now Karen claims he's a drug dealer. Really? Does that sound believable to anyone? A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Even Harold crossed his arms, glaring at Karen. This doesn't sit right, Karen. Not one bit. For the first time all evening, Karen's grip on the crowd faltered. Her smile twitched. Her voice rose higher, more desperate. Don't listen to her. Don't listen to him. I'm the HOA president. I know what's best for this community. But the more she shouted, the more people recoiled. And then came the final crack. My phone, confiscated and tossed onto the table, buzzed loudly. On the screen flashed a secure, encrypted call from Carter. Deputy Director Carter, my second in command. The vibration drew every eye in the room. Karen snatched it up before I could, waving it like evidence. Another fake contact. This man is nothing but a con artist. But then the phone unlocked automatically with facial recognition as she held it near me. And on speaker, Carter's voice boomed through the clubhouse. Director Grant, Protocol 7 has been activated. Extraction team en route. ETA 2 minutes. The room went dead silent. Karen's face drained of all color. She dropped the phone like it burned her. Rick and Tommy stepped back, suddenly unsure. The neighbors gasped, some even laughing nervously at the absurdity of what they were witnessing. I looked up at Karen, calm as ever, and said softly, 2 minutes, Karen. That's all you've got left. Her hands trembled. For the first time, she had no words. And in that moment, the truth had broken through. The queen of the HOA wasn't in control anymore. She was cornered, exposed, and on the brink of collapse. The clubhouse had fallen into stunned silence. My phone still buzzed faintly on the folding table where Karen had dropped it, Carter's voice replaying in everyone's mind. Protocol 7 has been activated. Extraction team en route. ETA 2 minutes. Karen stood frozen pink suit, trembling under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her hand twitched toward the bag of powder, then away again, as if she could somehow erase what had just happened. Rick Dalton glanced at Tommy Briggs, both men visibly shaken, no longer the cocky enforcers they had been minutes earlier. Emily took a step closer to me, her eyes wet with relief and fury all at once. She whispered, barely audible, "They're coming for you." And I nodded. 2 minutes. I leaned back in the chair, zip ties biting into my wrists, and locked eyes with Karen. "Tick-tock," I murmured. The sound of engines broke the air, low, guttural, unmistakable. Moments later, 3 black SUVs swung into the cul-de-sac, tires screeching as they braked in perfect synchronization. Neighbors gasped and stumbled back, phones rising higher to capture the spectacle. The doors of the SUVs flew open and out poured a dozen men and women in tactical gear. Not the cheap knockoffs. Rick and Tommy wore these were the real deal. Dark blue jackets with bright yellow lettering FBI. The kind of presence that makes even hardened criminals drop to their knees. At the front was Deputy Director Carter. A tall, broad man with silver hair cropped close, his eyes as sharp as the first day I met him. He moved with authority, flanked by agents who swept the area with precision weapons, holstered but hands ready. Director Grant Carter's voice boomed as he entered the clubhouse. "We apologize for the delay. Extraction team secure." Karen staggered backward, her face pale as paper. "Director," she stammered. The room erupted into chaos. Neighbors gasped, some clapped hands over their mouths, others whispered furiously. Phones tilted up to capture Carter's every word. Karen tried to recover, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a choke. "He's lying. This is some kind of act. These men aren't real." Carter cut her off with a single gesture. He held up his badge for everyone to see. "Deputy Director Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the man you've assaulted, framed, and humiliated in front of this entire community is Director Michael Grant, head of the FBI." Gasps, murmurs. Some neighbors even cheered. Emily covered her mouth, shoulders shaking with tears. Rick's face went slack. Tommy cursed under his breath. Karen simply froze lips, trembling eyes darting around as though searching for an escape hatch. Carter continued, his voice crisp. "We have multiple eyewitnesses. We have surveillance footage. We have your fingerprints all over that bag of powder. And now, thanks to your own arrogance, we have a live-streamed record of you planting evidence." He nodded toward the cluster of teenagers outside, still broadcasting every second on their phones. Karen clutched at the table for support, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, this can't be." I stood slowly as one of the agents sliced through the zip ties with a knife. Rubbing my sore wrists, I straightened my torn jacket, adjusted my tie, and finally addressed Karen directly. My voice carried across the room low but thunderous in its weight. "Karen Whitfield, you thought you ruled this neighborhood. You thought your power games made you untouchable. But you forgot one thing." She blinked rapidly, eyes wide. What's that?" I stepped closer just enough that she could see the calm certainty in my gaze. "The law doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people. And tonight it's coming for you." The agents moved in. Rick and Tommy were the first to crumble. Rick raised his hands muttering, I didn't know," while Tommy dropped the nightstick and tried to slip out the back, only to be tackled and cuffed. Karen, however, tried one last desperate gamble. She snatched the bag of powder from the table, clutching it to her chest. "This isn't mine, he put it there, he's the criminal." Carter raised an eyebrow, signaling to an agent. The agent pulled out a portable forensic scanner, snapped a photo of the baggie, and within seconds displayed the result: clear fingerprints. Karen's fivered. The neighbors gasped again. One man shouted, "She planted it." Another added, "We all saw her wave it around." The tide had fully turned. Karen's knees buckled. She collapsed into the chair I had vacated, her eyes hollow, her bravado shattered. I didn't mean, it was just." But excuses meant nothing now. Emily rushed to my side, gripping my arm tightly. Relief poured through her tears as she whispered, "It's over." I placed a hand over hers, steadying her. For her, yes, but for us, it's just beginning. Because I knew this wasn't just about Karen anymore. Her little charade had exposed something rotten. Rick and Tommy weren't random thugs. They were part of a network Karen had built to terrorize neighbors. And now that the FBI had its hands on the evidence, the investigation would spread far beyond this cul-de-sac. Carter confirmed it as he addressed the room. "Karen Whitfield, Rick Dalton, and Tommy Briggs, you are under federal investigation for impersonation of law enforcement, tampering with evidence, false imprisonment, and attempted framing of a federal officer. You have the right to remain silent." The words rang through the clubhouse like a final bell. The neighbors erupted in cheers and jeers. Some shouted justice, others recorded with glee. After months, years, even of Karen's reign of terror, they were finally seeing her brought low. Karen's head dropped into her hands as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. Her neon suit looked less like power now and more like a costume of failure. I turned to Carter. "Secure the evidence. Every scrap. This doesn't stop here." He nodded. "Already in motion, sir." And as the agents escorted Karen, Rick, and Tommy out of the clubhouse, I stepped forward to address the neighbors myself. For too long, fear ruled this community. For too long, you believed you had no choice but to follow one person's twisted idea of control. But remember this, the truth always wins. Power built on lies always collapses. Tonight proves it. The room erupted into applause. Emily squeezed my hand tighter. Karen Whitfield had planted drugs in my car. She thought she had planted my downfall. But instead she had planted the seeds of her own destruction. And the harvest had just begun. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind. Karen Whitfield had gone from HOA queen to federal detainee in the blink of an eye, and the fallout was seismic. For me, it wasn't personal revenge, it was procedure. And if there's one thing the FBI does, well, it's procedure. Karen, Rick, and Tommy were transferred from the local precinct straight to a federal holding facility. The moment their mugshots hit, the system phones across Oak Ridge Estates lit up like fireworks. Neighbors who once trembled under Karen's glare now passed screenshots of her in an orange jumpsuit back and forth, giddy with schadenfreude. But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because Karen wasn't just guilty of one bad stunt. Her frame-up attempt was the tip of the iceberg. I knew instinctively that a woman this brazen didn't stop at one crime. My gut told me she had a history, and my gut had never been wrong. So I called Carter into my office. He came in with a thick folder under his arm, his expression tight. "You were right, sir," he said, laying the file on my desk. "This wasn't her first rodeo. We've already tied her to at least 14 incidents of harassment, falsified HOA citations, and intimidation." I flipped through the pages. Photos of crying homeowners. Complaints that went nowhere. Fines that never should have been issued. Threatening letters signed with Karen's looping cursive. and worse, anonymous tips to local police about suspicious behavior that always targeted minority families. And the thugs I asked, Carter slid another folder across. Dalton and Briggs both have priors. Assault impersonation, even a weapons charge. But here's the kicker, Karen paid them under the table through HOA funds. We're talking embezzlement on top of everything else. I leaned back, fingers steepled. So she wasn't just abusing power. She was stealing from the very people she claimed to protect. Carter nodded grimly. We're estimating over $100,000 siphoned into fake security contracts, all signed off by Karen. That was the nail in her coffin. We assembled a task force overnight, combing through years of HOA records, bank statements, and complaint logs. Each document painted the same picture. Karen's reign wasn't neighborhood management, it was organized extortion dressed in pastel suits. The public loved it. News vans swarmed the cul-de-sac anchors, breathlessly reporting how a suburban HOA scandal exposed deep corruption. Clips of Karen waving the cocaine baggie like a victory flag went viral. The irony was too juicy for anyone to resist. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Karen wasn't laughing anymore. I sat across from her, recorder on the table, agents flanking the walls. Her once perfect hair was a frizzy mess, her makeup smudged. She leaned forward, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling slightly, despite the bravado she tried to summon. "Michael, please," she whispered, dropping the sharp tone she once used to cut me down. "This is all a misunderstanding." "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I raised an eyebrow. "You planted drugs in my car, Karen. You hired criminals to play dress-up as cops. You tried to humiliate me in front of my wife and neighbors. And you didn't mean for it to go this far." Her lips quivered. "It was just supposed to scare you, to make you respect the rules. You think you're better than everyone, but this is my neighborhood, my rules." I let the silence hang, her words echoing back at her. Then I leaned forward. "That's the difference between us, Karen. You think rules are toys to bend. I enforce laws that protect people, real people. And tonight the law is protecting them from you." Her eyes hardened for a moment, the old Karen flickering back. "You won't win. I still have friends. Influence. I'll get out, and when I do, I cut her off, sliding a photo across the table. It showed her fingerprints lifted off the baggie of cocaine. Next to it, a still frame from a neighbor's live stream, where she was clearly slipping it into my car. Her mouth fell open, her voice cracked. "That's not fair. Neither is prison," I replied. "But you're going there." And she did. The trial was swift. With video evidence, financial records, and testimony from nearly every neighbor she'd tormented, the jury took less than 3 hours to deliver the verdict, guilty on all counts. Rick and Tommy pled out, taking reduced sentences in exchange for testifying against her. They admitted everything: how Karen recruited them, how she loved the power trip, how she called herself the judge of Oak Ridge. When the judge read Karen's sentence, 12 years in federal prison plus restitution to the HOA, there was an audible sigh of relief in the courtroom. Some neighbors even clapped until the bailiff told them to stop. Emily held my hand the whole time. Tears of relief streamed down her face as we walked out of the courthouse, cameras, flashing microphones shoved in my direction. I gave no statements. This wasn't about fame, it was about justice. Still, justice had ripple effects. Within weeks, the federal investigation spread to other HOAs in the region, uncovering a web of shady practices, inflated fines, bogus citations, misuse of funds. Karen's fall had cracked open the dam. Reform was on the horizon. But the most powerful moment came not in court, not on the news, but in my own neighborhood. One evening after Karen had been transferred to a prison upstate, the neighbors gathered on the green. No fines, no citations, no fear. Just families sharing food, children running free, and laughter echoing under the twilight sky. Mrs. Johnson raised a toast. To Michael, our neighbor, our protector, and apparently our FBI director. Everyone cheered. Emily squeezed my hand tighter, smiling for the first time in weeks. I looked around at their faces, faces that had once been cowed by Karen's tyranny, now free, open, full of hope, and I thought, this is why we fight. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for people to live without fear. Karen had tried to plant drugs in my car. Instead, she planted the seeds of her own downfall and the roots of change for everyone else. And for once, Oak Ridge Estates finally felt like home. Oak Ridge Estates had never been so quiet. Not the suffocating silence that had once blanketed the cul-de-sac under Karen Whitfield's rule, but a peaceful stillness. For the first time in years, neighbors left their blinds open without fear of citations. Lawns grew a little wild, mailboxes leaned slightly, crooked bicycles lay scattered on driveways, and nobody cared. It was freedom, in the smallest, sweetest forms. Karen was gone. Sentenced, shackled, and stripped of her faux crown, she no longer loomed over the neighborhood like a neon-clad tyrant. Her pink suits gathered dust in an evidence locker, her shrill voice silenced by cold concrete walls. Rick and Tommy, her loyal HOA security, were reduced to inmates swapping war stories for commissary snacks. The HOA itself had dissolved, dismantled, after federal auditors uncovered years of fraudulent records. For most people, the story ended there. Justice served. Curtain closed. But for me, Michael Grant, director of the FBI Husband-Neighbor, it was far from over. Because justice doesn't just end with a conviction. Justice must ripple. In the weeks following the trial, Congress fast-tracked hearings on HOA abuse. Karen's case had gone viral. Memes of her screaming, "I am the law," circulated the internet like wildfire. Late-night comedians mocked her neon suits and tyrannical clipboard. But beyond the humor, a serious conversation took root. Lawmakers introduced new regulations requiring transparency in homeowner associations, civilian oversight of HOA boards, and harsh penalties for impersonating law enforcement. I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, not as the man Karen had tried to humiliate, but as a public servant. I told them about the Johnsons' fines, the Lee's pool, the roses Emily had to cut down because of a cruel citation. I spoke about fear disguised as community standards, and how power unchecked can corrupt even the quietest streets. Karen Whitfield wasn't an anomaly, I told them. She was a symptom. And if we want safe communities, we can't let symptoms metastasize into disease. The bill passed. The Federal Neighborhood Accountability Act, a mouthful, yes, but a turning point. Back in Oak Ridge, the neighbors decided to commemorate the change. They pooled together not through fines or threats, but through donations, and erected a small memorial at the end of the street. A polished stone plaque that read, "Truth always wins. Justice belongs to the people." I stood before that plaque one evening, Emily's hand in mine. The setting sun bathed the cul-de-sac in gold laughter from children playing nearby, filling the air. For the first time, Oak Ridge felt like the place we'd always dreamed it could be. Emily squeezed my hand gently. "It's finally over." I shook my head. Not over, but better. And that's enough. Because I knew Karen still lingered even behind bars. Reports trickled in her prison letters were full of complaints, accusations, desperate denials. She still called herself a wronged leader, claimed she'd been set up. Some people never change, but her words carried no power anymore. No fines, no citations, no fake cops to enforce them. Just ink on paper, discarded by wardens, laughed at by guards. And me, I moved forward. The roses Emily had once cut down bloomed again, fuller and more vibrant than before. The neighbors gathered for barbecues, birthday parties, and impromptu block celebrations. And every time someone joked about HOA law, it was met with laughter instead of dread. Standing there looking at the plaque, I couldn't help but smile. Karen thought she planted drugs in my car. What she really planted was her own downfall, and the seed of something stronger, community resilience, and a reminder that no one, not even a self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac, is above the law. And that, more than anything, was her true legacy. If there's one thing I've learned from this ordeal, it's that power reveals character. Some people, when given even the smallest slice of authority, will use it to build, to protect, to uplift. Others, like Karen, will twist it into a weapon, using rules as shackles and neighbors as pawns. But here's the truth. Lies don't last. Fear doesn't last. What lasts is courage, the courage of those who refuse to bow, the courage to wait, to endure, and to strike when the time is right. Karen thought she was writing my downfall, but all she did was author her own. For you watching this right now, maybe your Karen isn't an HOA president. Maybe it's a boss, a neighbor, a politician, or even your own doubt. Whoever it is, remember, this justice might take time, but it always finds its way. The truth might be buried, but it never dies. And when the moment comes, when the lies collapse and the truth stands tall, you'll realize that patience, integrity, and resilience are the strongest weapons of all. So tell me, what's the biggest Karen you've faced in your life? Drop it in the comments. And if this story hit you, subscribe for more tales where justice doesn't just knock, it kicks the door down. Because sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it chains the liar instead.